Hi everyone, it's attorney Robert Byrne. Thank you so much for visiting my channel. Should a tractor trailer company be on the hook for $100 million when one of its drivers is driving down the highway below the speed limit and a vehicle from an opposite lane of travel comes across the median, loses control, and crashes into the truck, and there are horrible injuries and a death that results? That's a question that was presented by Dave at Smart Trucking, and I want to really take a close look at that because Dave said that what happened to Werner Enterprises in a case where that situation occurred was a grave injustice. And Dave from Smart Trucking is not alone here. There are a ton of talking heads in the media, on social media, who are saying that what happened to Werner Enterprises in that verdict from Texas is a grave miscarriage of justice. I disagree with this take, and in this video I want to accomplish three things. First, I want to take a deep dive into the facts of this case to see if Werner Enterprises really was an innocent company or whether it had what the law calls unclean hands and it somehow contributed to this crash. Second, I want to take a look at nuclear verdicts in general and see what factors may have contributed to this particular verdict and to show maybe why something like this doesn't happen in every case and why people shouldn't be concerned about a nuclear verdict in every case. And third, I want to just kind of share some insights, some information about how truckers and trucking companies might be able to take steps to be safer and to avoid verdicts like this in the first place. Stay tuned. Before I begin, I do have a couple of disclosures and disclaimers that I need to make. And so the first one is, I am a plaintiff's injury trial attorney. So I represent people who have been injured in terrible crashes, oftentimes with tractor trailers. In fact, I recently took and passed the board certification exam to become a board certified attorney in truck accident law. So naturally, I take a viewpoint that is very different to what the truck industry is going to be taking. I'm coming from the opposite side of the equation from Smart Trucking, and I do want to disclose that. Another thing I want to point out is that even though I do plaintiffs' personal injury cases a lot of times in trucking litigation, I'm not anti-trucker in any way. In fact, several of my clients have been other truckers who have been injured by other dangerous truckers. It's unfortunately the case that tractor trailers are massive targets on the highway, and oftentimes out of control tractor trailers coming from the opposite directions will have head-on collisions or T-bone collisions with my clients who are driving tractor trailers. They have their vehicles under control, they're going the proper speed, they're doing everything by the book, but yet they suffer terrible injuries because of the mistakes of another driver. So I do want to say that I'm taking a position that is very pro-safety for all motorists, whether they're families in passenger vehicles or they are truckers themselves in 18-wheelers or other commercial vehicles. One final disclaimer. Because I'm an attorney myself, I am providing information that's of a legal nature, but this is not advice. The information that I'm providing is information only. It's coming from a legal perspective, but every case is different. So if you do have legal questions for which you seek legal advice, please talk to an attorney and don't rely upon any information that I'm providing upon which to make decisions that have legal implications. So having discussed all that, let's get into the facts of this particular case. It was December 30th, 2014 in western Texas. A pickup truck driven by a gentleman named Trey Salinas was heading in an eastbound direction on Interstate 20 in Texas near Odessa. Trey had 4 passengers in his vehicle that day. Jennifer Blake, her 14-year-old son, her 12-year-old daughter, and her 7-year-old little boy. I think it's helpful to understand that Odessa, Texas pretty much has a desert climate. So they have hot, dry summers and they have mild, dry winters. So they're not a place that has major winter events on a regular basis where there's going to be lots of snow and there's going to be major ice storms. That may happen occasionally, but it does not happen often. But December 30th, 2014 was different. On that day, the National Weather Service had issued a winter storm warning. There was both rain and potentially freezing temperatures, which were the perfect mix to create freezing rain and bring with it black ice. Mr. Salinas was driving in his pickup that day with his 4 passengers, and he lost control of his pickup on Interstate 20. Here's a photograph from Google Maps that gives you a rough idea of where this crash occurred. It's not the exact location because I wasn't able to actually ascertain it, but this shows that stretch of Interstate 20 from the vantage point of what Mr. Salinas would have seen. And as you can see, there's a grassy median, and I believe at this time there was no barrier between the lanes. Instead, there was a patch of grass, and then there was another lane of travel heading from the opposite direction on the other side of the median. The median at that location was approximately 42 feet wide. Mr. Salinas, while he was driving, lost control of his vehicle, went through the 42-foot grassy median, and collided with an oncoming 18-wheeler that was going approximately 43 miles per hour in a 75 mile per hour zone. The crash was utterly devastating for Jennifer Blake and her family. The 7-year-old little boy was killed from the impact of the collision. The 12-year-old girl sustained a severe brain injury and was left a quadriplegic, being paralyzed from the neck down. The 14-year-old boy suffered a variety of orthopedic injuries, like to his shoulder, also a lung injury, and a bunch of other related but smaller injuries. The mom herself sustained a mild traumatic brain injury and a bunch of other injuries. And this doesn't even get into all of the emotional trauma that the family sustained as a result of this particular crash. And Ms. Blake filed a lawsuit against Werner Enterprises, the driver of the Werner truck, and Mr. Salinas. After a civil trial that lasted several weeks with dozens of witnesses and thousands of pages of documents, the jury awarded a verdict against Werner Enterprises and its driver for approximately $90 million. So let's kind of summarize this really quickly. A jury awarded $90 million against a trucking company, even though the truck was driving in its own lane. It was under control. It was traveling at least 30 miles per hour under the posted speed limit at the time. The truck driver had the truck under proper control at the time the crash happened, and there was very little time, if any at all, for the truck driver to react in time to avoid the collision from Mr. Salinas' oncoming pickup truck. So let's take a deep dive into that evidence. On the day of this crash, there wasn't just bad weather that was happening. There wasn't just a storm that was occurring. There was an active winter storm warning from the National Weather Service. And when there's a warning, that means that either the danger that they're warning about is happening or it's going to happen imminently. So this isn't something where they're saying, hey, there's a 50% chance of showers today and it might get colder, but it was something instead where they're saying, this is happening or it's going to be happening. You need to act appropriately in light of that. So arguably, the most dangerous weather conditions that can exist are those that create icy roads. If a motorist doesn't have traction, if they don't have the ability to grip the road, they're not going to be able to stop or slow down as needed depending on what the circumstances require. So Werner's own safety director testified to the jury that Werner was well aware of the dangers caused by icy roads. He said, for instance, that all vehicles, certainly passenger vehicles included, are more likely to lose control on icy roads, and that nobody should drive on ice. So that was actual evidence that the jury heard from Werner's own safety representative. There was also evidence that because of the dangers that black ice presents, drivers must be aware of the outside temperature as their vehicle is going down the road, especially when there's moisture present. And in fact, the truck that was being driven on December 30th, 2014 had 2 gauges in it that could be used to tell what the outside air was. However, the driver of the vehicle was a trainee, and his supervisor was in the vehicle with him at the time of the crash but was sleeping. And the supervisor had prohibited the trainee from using those devices to determine what the outside air temperature was. In another interesting twist, it turns out that a supervisor of this particular trainee was probably necessary for a multitude of reasons, including the fact that just 2 weeks prior, this particular trainee had received very low evaluation scores. And so it was very clear to Werner that this driver needed improvement. In fact, there was some evidence that the driver had not even completed some winter weather driving training that Werner offered. Even though that particular trainee driver had not been given the training about how to always properly drive in certain weather conditions, the trainee also knew some of the particular dangers that were posed by a tractor trailer that was going highway speeds in these bad weather conditions. Now, there was also testimony from police officers and other motorists who were on the road on December 30th, 2014. One state trooper, for instance, testified that he was on that stretch of Interstate 20 around the time that the collision happened. He said that it was completely icy. He said that the road was very unsafe to drive on, and he was having to go between 5 to 10 miles per hour based on the road conditions as he perceived them. He actually saw a vehicle going approximately 20 to 30 miles per hour on these icy roads, and he ticketed that driver for driving in excessive speed. In fact, that state trooper saw this driver driving down the road between 20 to 30 miles per hour. The driver lost control of his vehicle, went across the grassy median, and caused a collision in the other lane of travel, which is exactly what happened in this crash. The officer said that that particular driver knew that the roads were unsafe. As he put it, she was in it. Everybody was. As many crashes as I'm sure she's passed along the way, she would have known that going at the rate of speed she was going was unsafe for those roadway conditions. He also testified that the roadway conditions were growing worse over time. So this officer said, I ticketed this lady who saw these disabled vehicles and was still driving 20 to 30 miles per hour, even though the speed limit was 75 miles per hour, because 20 to 30 was way too fast under those conditions. And even though that police officer was driving with his emergency lights on, he said he was only going between 5 to 10 miles per hour because of the icy conditions. But here's what's really interesting. Not only did that state trooper make all those determinations and ticket that particular driver for going 20 to 30 miles per hour for causing a collision, but it turns out that the Werner Enterprises driver drove the Werner truck past that crash scene at that time and saw exactly what happened, saw that there was a vehicle that was in the opposite lane of travel that had gone across the median, and he nevertheless continued down the highway going approximately 45 to 50 miles per hour. Based on that, the Werner driver knew or should have known that it was foreseeable that a vehicle would lose control and shoot across the road because they were dealing with some horrendous traffic conditions. But the evidence at trial showed that the Werner driver had driven by another collision before that one, approximately 37 minutes before the crash that occurred, and still was undeterred after seeing disabled vehicles, seeing collisions, seeing one where a passenger vehicle shot across the median. He still continued going down the highway approximately 45 to 50 miles per hour. Other drivers at trial testified about how icy the road was. One driver testified that he believed that the Werner truck was driving too fast based on what he observed and what he saw that particular day. one motorist testified that after the crash, he stopped to get out to offer assistance. But he's wearing tennis shoes and the road was so slippery that he could barely stand and walk on it in his tennis shoes. There was a local tow truck driver who testified that he was on the road that day. He was helping move some vehicles around apparently, and he said that based on the conditions of the road, he could only drive about 10 to 15 miles per hour safely. Some of the witnesses to the roads that day stated that the roads were like a skating rink, they were so icy. So based on all these accounts, there was plenty of evidence for the jury to determine that the road conditions were extremely hazardous due to the existence of black ice on the roads. And the jury also heard that despite how hazardous these roads were, at the time that the collision occurred, the Werner truck was being driven approximately 43 miles per hour. Remember, a police officer had ticketed someone for going between 20 and 30, and this truck is going roughly double that speed. So there's a winter storm warning with freezing rain, but then the evidence shows that Werner didn't tell its drivers about the winter storm warning. And that's because Werner viewed the weather event that was happening as a local event. They didn't think that it was something that it was necessary to spread out to all of the drivers. So here's where this case takes a deadly twist that I think a lot of folks are not really giving fair attention to. Despite knowing the weather conditions, the fact that the driver needed improvement, the fact that all of these things were happening at once, Werner gave a special load to the trainee driver with his supervisor that's called a just-in-time delivery. A just-in-time delivery is one where the trucking company guarantees that the load will be delivered by a certain time. And there is a 100% on-time expectation for a just-in-time delivery. So a Werner driver that failed to make a just-in-time delivery by the deadline could face discipline. In fact, if a driver failed to meet a deadline 4 times for a just-in-time delivery, they could face termination as a driver. So you have this situation where not only is this trainee incentivized to probably try to clear his name after having a bad evaluation just a couple of weeks before, but he wants to impress his boss by getting that delivery in time to the ultimate destination despite the bad weather that was occurring. And so you have this complete recipe for disaster that's occurring. So we see all of this evidence, and now we need to view it in light of what the law and the industry standards for the trucking industry require. So to prevail in a negligence action against a driver or a trucking company, an injured party needs to show that the driver or the trucking company failed to act like a reasonable driver or reasonable trucking company would have acted under those same circumstances. So when you consider the weather, you consider the need to have a qualified driver who's experienced with bad weather. All of these circumstances, what would a reasonable truck driver and a reasonable trucking company do? And if the driver and the trucking company failed to act reasonably and they caused injuries as a result of that, then the plaintiff, the injured party, is entitled to be compensated for that. The starting place to figure out what would a reasonable driver and reasonable trucking company do under circumstances starts with a certain body of regulations called the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, or the FMCSR. And the FMCSR are this very long and detailed body of regulations that basically say what a trucker and what a trucking company must do to keep themselves and other motorists safe. The regulations recognize that truckers and trucking companies are a business and they're operating as a business, and they're a for-profit entity and they're trying to make a profit. There's nothing wrong with that. However, the regulations do say that certain minimum standards must be met for the driver and the trucking company to be considered safe. So the regulations deal with all sorts of different situations, but there's one in particular that's applicable to this case, and that's found in 49 CFR section 392.14, which talks about what a driver must do when they face hazardous conditions that impair either visibility or traction. So when a driver faces these hazardous conditions, which are typically caused by weather, the driver has to exercise what's called extreme caution. And extreme caution, at a minimum, requires the driver to slow way down because there may be a storm that's happening that is preventing visibility. There could be fog. Or you could have, with an ice storm, something that's going to impair visibility because you could have a windshield that is icing over. You're going to have roads that are icing over. And so the tires are not going to be able to grip and they're not going to be able to have traction. And that's why a driver must drastically reduce their speed. And if it's not safe to drive, they actually have to stop driving until it's safe for them to resume driving. But the regulations don't say exactly what a safe speed is. But the regulations require all states to have a commercial driver's license manual. In Texas, just like every other state, has a commercial driver's license manual that tells commercial motor vehicle drivers, like the Werner driver, what they must do to satisfy the federal regulations. So one section in particular of the Texas CDL manual, which is section 2.6.2, is entitled Matching Speed to the Road Service. Basically, the CDL manual says that to be able to brake, a truck must have traction. Here, section 2.6.2 of the CDL manual instructs drivers to reduce their speed to a crawl when they encounter icy roads. And according to expert testimony in this case, a crawl in the trucking industry means between 10 to 15 miles per hour, which is consistent with some of the other testimony that came in from a police officer who was driving 5 to 10 miles per hour, and the tow truck operator who was driving 10 to 15 miles per hour. Both were following this rule of thumb that a crawl should be 10 to 15 miles per hour. At the trial of this case, the Blakes had an expert who said that the safe driving regulations required the Werner driver to reduce the speed down to 10 to 15 miles per hour when it became apparent that there were dangerous driving conditions. Among other things, the driver was able to see that there were vehicles that were disabled. The driver could see that there were vehicles and collisions that had occurred. And the driver should have known, based on some of the other information that was presented, that the conditions were unsafe. And the fact that the driver had reduced the speed from 75 down to 43 shows that the driver knew that the conditions were bad enough that it was required that he slow the vehicle way down. And there was evidence that Werner teaches its drivers that they can slow down to a crawl or stop unless they feel that it's unsafe to drive. But if they don't feel that it's unsafe to drive, they can continue to drive just like the Werner driver did in this case. So in light of all this, there was a ton of evidence available for the jury to say, you know what, Werner acted unreasonably. Their driver acted unreasonably. They ignored the requirements of the commercial driver's license manual. They didn't exercise extreme caution as required by the federal regulations. They didn't act reasonably based on what they saw and experienced leading up to this crash. So the big question then turns to, was there evidence that their negligence in that regard caused the crash and the injuries that resulted? The Blakes had an accident reconstructionist who testified that if the Werner truck had been going 10 to 15 miles per hour instead of 45 to 50, then this crash never would have happened. According to the expert, The time, speed, and distance involved would have prevented this crash from happening. The truck would have been approaching the oncoming vehicle at a much slower rate of speed. He would have been able to use his brakes, would have been able to slow down, and would have been able to stop. This crash wouldn't have happened. The 7-year-old boy would have survived. The 12-year-old would not have been paralyzed. And the other injuries to the 14-year-old and the mom would not have happened. So based on all this evidence, I respectfully disagree with any contention that this was a completely unfair verdict because Werner was an innocent party. Werner did not have clean hands. They took some risks. They took some unnecessary risks. And that's what caused this crash to happen. It was a very preventable crash if Werner had just followed some simple rules about matching the speed to the road surface, about exercising extreme caution, about not giving a driver a timed route, a just-in-time route when there's a winter storm warning that is occurring. When you add all these things together, I think it's a stretch, and I don't think that you can fairly look at the evidence and say that Werner did nothing wrong. I think it's important because you don't reach these conclusions only by looking back in hindsight and saying, being a Monday morning quarterback and saying, oh yeah, it's very clear why this happened. This is stuff that when you're looking at it in real time, based on what was happening, it looks like a complete recipe for a disaster that was just waiting to happen. And to the extent someone wasn't injured or killed, it would be by sheer luck, not because the trucking company and its driver did everything right. And granted, like I said, I'm a trucking lawyer. I represent people who are injured and families who have a loved one killed as a result of negligent conduct by a trucking company or its driver. But these timed routes are a major problem, and they are just begging for these types of injuries and problems to occur. So this all brings me to my second point, which is, why do nuclear verdicts like this happen? I think that some defense attorneys and insurance companies will try to scare you into believing that this happens in every case, or that there's the potential that this type of a verdict can happen in any case, and it's just a matter of time before it happens to you. But nuclear verdicts like this don't happen in every case. And they don't happen because jurors are not out to get truckers and trucking companies. Juries recognize that the job of a trucker is very, very difficult. What I think juries find completely unacceptable and perhaps unforgivable is when trucking companies make their drivers cut corners and gamble with safety rules just so they can try to maybe increase their profit, or perhaps try to make a little bit more money, or be a little bit faster or a little bit better than the competition. And when they do that and they place the public at risk, that's the sort of situation that is going to lead to a potential nuclear verdict when a family or an innocent party like a little 7-year-old boy is killed as a result of those shortcuts. And that's especially true in a case where a trucking company cuts corners, causes disastrous injuries or death, and then they won't take responsibility for doing anything wrong. That's the sort of thing where a jury's going to say, there's a major problem here, and if this is not acknowledged by the trucking company, if we don't do something about this, it's going to happen again. Nuclear verdicts happen against large companies because the companies are not taking responsibility. They're putting profits over safety, and they're placing people at risk. Some of these massive trucking companies have loads of resources. They have mountains of resources behind them. They're not going to be in a position where maybe making a few hundred extra dollars by doing a just-in-time delivery is going to change the bottom line in any way. But having that just-in-time delivery could place so many people at risk. These companies, they can exercise some restraint and have standards that say, to the extent we're going to do a just-in-time delivery, we're only going to do it when the weather cooperates. We're not going to be doing it on a busy holiday travel time when the roads are jam-packed. They're going to do it in times, in places, in ways where they can minimize any disruption or potential injury to anyone else. So this brings me to my third big point, which are just some kind of miscellaneous takeaways that I see that perhaps truckers and trucking companies can do to make the roadways safer. I don't want to sit here as a plaintiff's attorney and say my job here is solely to get money for people who are injured. My job is to help prevent these types of crashes from occurring in the first place, because they utterly destroy people's lives and families' lives. So the first takeaway, these types of nuclear verdicts don't happen in every case. It's like, as I was saying, there's some wonderful drivers out there. The majority of drivers are very safe, and they are conscientious, and they're focused on doing their job and doing it well. They follow the rules. They do what the standards require of them, and they're safe as a result. It's only when you agree to cut corners because you're trying to save money or trying to make more money, or you're trying to please someone by, shaving off just a little bit of time, that's where the danger is greatly enhanced. People are placed at risk, and there's always the risk of a nuclear verdict. So if you are a driver, just follow the rules. Resist the temptation to take these risky routes and dispatches that are going to unnecessarily place people at risk. Second, if you are a driver and you're in a crash and you cause harm to someone, make sure you hold your insurance company's feet to the fire. Insurance companies owe a duty to try to resolve cases within the insurance policy limits. And so if you're in a situation where there's terrible injuries that have occurred and the insurance company is not protecting you by trying to resolve the case within the coverage limits, you may need to take things into your hand to protect yourself by hiring your own private attorney and having the private attorney do a couple of different things, such as talk to the insurance defense attorney and say, listen, I'm watching this here. You guys better protect your file because you have a duty to resolve this, and you should resolve this. You also may want to have your private attorney reach out to a plaintiff's attorney and say, listen, we're trying to get this thing resolved, but the insurance company is not doing what is required. Now, I'm not giving legal advice here, but what I am saying is that it is imperative that insurance companies protect their insured drivers. And that is something, as a policyholder, we all must insist upon, that our insurance companies protect us, because we pay the premiums and we do what's required to make sure we have that peace of mind. Those insurance companies need to step up when we need them, when we mess up, and they have to provide the protection that they promise. A third miscellaneous point that Smart Trucking raised is that if anybody should be responsible for what happened to the Blake family from a financial perspective, it should be the state of Texas. And I want to push back against that, because what that's saying is that the taxpayers should foot this bill. It's not the taxpayers who decided to send a truck out to go 43 miles, 50 miles per hour on an icy road. It's not the taxpayers who decided to maintain that speed. It's not the taxpayers who made a promise to a party that they would guarantee a delivery within a certain time period. That was something that Werner did, and that's something that Werner should be held responsible for. But even if you say, well, that's unfair to Werner, it's important that to recognize that trucking companies have insurance to protect against situations exactly like this. These insurance companies are going to do a review to find out what sort of policies do these trucking companies have in place. And if they know about those things and they issue a policy anyway, then that insurance company has incurred that risk and they are protecting a company like Werner from it. And so it's unfair to say, well, the taxpayers should foot the bill for a lifetime of medical care that's going to be needed by this family, when there's a company that decided to take these risks, and there's an insurance company that decided to insure against those risks. And so those are the parties that our system is set up that the party that's responsible should handle it. There's a whole lot more that we can go into about this case. I'm just scratching the surface about all the legal issues that have come out in this case, and I'm talking about the evidence that was presented by the first appellate court in this case. Werner has appealed this decision to the Supreme Court of Texas, and so there will be a second appellate review of this that'll probably come down in the next year. But I want to thank you for watching this video. It was a long one. There's a lot of information. There's a whole lot to digest. I know that I've probably ruffled some feathers and maybe made some enemies from some of you who hear this and just think it's completely outrageous. But I really think it's helpful to engage in this and say, did Werner act as a reasonably safe company would under the circumstances of this case? And I think if you really look at it that way and look at the evidence, you'll reach the conclusion that there was a whole lot of stuff that they could have done differently. And if they had done it differently, this crash wouldn't have happened. So thanks again. I hope that you'll consider subscribing and liking this video. Trucking crashes are very emotional events, and I know that a lot of people are going to have thoughts about this. But I'd love to hear them, and I'd love to have a dialogue, and love to hear your thoughts about maybe what could have been done differently to avoid this outcome, maybe that wasn't mentioned, or what could be done to prevent this type of thing from happening again. Thanks so much, and I hope you stay tuned for more videos.